On this episode of FieldLink, we explore strategies to get the best weed control on a budget. Agronomist Matt Boyer and Helena product specialist Brad Hammis join us to discuss how some old school tactics for weed control might be the most strategic this growing season. Plus, Jody Lawrence joins us to discuss how the global soybean market is reacting to the South American soybean harvest. Finally, we'll discuss how the beef industry is cashing in on record prices and how the cattle herd numbers might impact our long-term beef supply. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to mark your calendars and join us for the 2025 Commodity Classic in Denver, Colorado on March 1st through the 3rd, as FieldLink will be live. We'll be there with market analyst Jody Lawrence as he will be joined with Chip Flory from AgriTalk and Sean Haney from Real Ag Radio. Join us in our booth on March 1st and March 2nd for these live recordings as we'll cover the latest in agriculture news, grain markets, policy. Plus, learn a thing or two about some of the latest products and technologies brought to you by Helena. We look forward to seeing you in Denver. And welcome back to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith. And today we're going to talk about effective weed management control on a budget. It's something all of us are certainly paying attention to as spring's getting closer and closer to the planters rolling and everything happening out there. We're kind of finalizing our weed control plans for a lot of producers across the country. And in a lot of cases, on a budget. And that's something we're going to talk to a lot about today. Joining us is agronomist Matt Boyer. Matt, welcome to FieldLink.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
You bet, Matt. Where's home today? Where'd you grow up and what's your role at Helena?
So I grew up in a tiny little town in northeast Iowa. If you take the far north and east county in the state, come back west one county, that's where I grew up. Currently live in Mason City, Iowa. So right off I-35, just almost to Minnesota, but not quite there. So my role with Helena is covering Iowa and Missouri really as that agronomic support person.
Okay, so you're covering a pretty wide range between the state of Missouri and Iowa. That's right in the heart of things in terms of corn country and, of course, soybeans and some other crops like alfalfa.
Yep, absolutely. Today it's cold in both of the states.
I think cold is the theme for this particular podcast for sure. And also joining us from Iowa is Brad Hammis. Brad is a product specialist. Brad, welcome back to FieldLink.
Hey, Bill. Thanks for having me again.
Brad, while we got you on the horn here, let's talk a little bit about you, what your role is at Helena, and what kind of solutions do you bring to producers?
Sure. My role in Helena being a product specialist means that I work for Helena Products Group. I get to be I guess you could call it the regional product expert for the Midwest, or at least what we call our Midwest, which is all our parts of 7 states, most of which touch some aspect of Iowa, which works out great for me because that's where I grew up and that's my current home.
Beautiful. Well, guys, like I said in the opening, 'tis this season. We're getting closer and closer to planting season. And I know you all have been traveling around, sitting down with producers at meetings, meeting with our sales reps and talking to growers from across, most of the Midwest about weed control. And that's certainly been on topic, and managing their weeds this year is really, really critical, and because many of them got a pretty tight budget. But Brad, you and I talked a little bit about this. Managing weeds on a budget, well, there's a lot of different ways to look at that. How do you view weed management on a tight budget as we get ready for Plant 25?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, what you have to consider is that the most expensive weed management program is the one that doesn't work. Right? So as you're building those plans out, just because something looks like it might save $1 or $2, if that makes your program less effective, and I think a lot of those ways that might become less effective are things that Matt's going to talk about as we go through our time here today. But it's about layering residuals. It's about trying to stop problems before they start. And it's about doing things right the first time.
I think that's so important for growers to understand that, sometimes doing it right the first time can save you so much money because you're not playing that catch up with a second treatment or sometimes even a third treatment or coming in with some products that may not be 100% the best fit during that time of year. So Matt, talk to us a little bit about this journey, this weed management journey that you're proposing as growers get ready for Plant 25.
Yeah, so when we have conversations, I usually kind of like to start with the basics, right? Before we just jump right into a solution, because that solution might not work for everybody. So when we sit down and we talk about herbicides or weed management programs, I like to start with mode of action and site of action. Ultimately, that way we know that we're on the same page when we're talking about group 15s or group 27s, right? I think that's pretty important. And then we also typically want to review the status of resistance management, because that is becoming more and more important every single year, and it's not just going to go away.
We're seeing a lot more resistance out there, aren't we, Matt? Are you seeing quite a bit more in your market?
Yeah, and it's starting to get pretty scary. So 2-3 years ago, we always kind of had a rabbit you could pull out of your hat with, you know what, Liberty or glufosinate. We can apply that to about anything. But now Missouri has confirmed Palmer amaranth that is resistant to glufosinate. So there's really no perfect bullet out there that we can use today anymore.
And that's clearly going to impact a lot of crops beyond corn and soybeans too. There's just becoming limited numbers of, I guess, as you mentioned, the silver bullet solution in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the crazy part is we've got a lot of, so if we, I'll just pick on the amaranth. So like Palmer amaranth, water hemp, some of the pigweeds, right? They're resistant to about 6 or 7 sites of action, unless we're talking about Palmer. And then it's up to 9. And it doesn't sound super scary or intimidating until we realize we only have 10, maybe 12 sites of action that we're using in a lot of these crops across the Midwest or even the NBU. So the fraction that are effective is decreasing rapidly.
Okay, Matt. So, we talk about, mode of action. Talk to us about the difference between mode of action versus site of action. They're two very different things, aren't they?
Yep. So herbicide mode of action is the bigger bucket, if you will, and it refers to how a herbicide actually affects the weed. So what you can see that weed is doing in response to a herbicide. So wilting or twisting, that's going to be from the growth regulators, that mode of action. Or if we're seeing some bleaching, we're going to have very likely the pigment inhibitors are going to be there, right? So that's a big bucket, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The herbicide site of action is that specific location, enzyme, or process that's affected by that herbicide. It's much more specific, right? And that's important when we're talking about resistance management. A good rule of thumb is if it's hard to pronounce, like acetyl-CoA carboxylase inhibitors,
Right.
or if it's 3 capitalized letters, right? It's very likely that it's a site of action. So I say that with jest, but it's a pretty good way to tell site of action versus mode of action.
That's perfect for the kind of learner that I am.
Yeah.
So, Matt, are we kind of getting back to, I guess, what I like to reserve, because I'm an old guy, the old school chemistry, spread it out, hitting them with different types of chemistry throughout the season?
Yeah, I think we 100% are there, specifically when it comes to, I hate using the word, back in the day, but really back in the day, if the weeds got up, man, we were ready. We had lost the fight, right? And we're almost getting there today that we need to control weeds before they ever emerge. That's our best chance of success. And then if they do pop up, we need to be going after them when they're really little, preferably less than an inch tall would be my recommendation.
So as we talk about managing weeds on a tighter budget, what are some of your, I guess, best practices that you recommend this year?
Yeah, first and foremost, we have to start clean. That goes with whether we're utilizing tillage or we're making burn down applications. Again, once the weeds are up, they're competing with our crop, and it's hard to get caught back up. So starting clean would be one. The other thing is residual herbicides. That needs to be the backbone of any herbicide program. We can't just rely on post-emerge one time, let alone 2 times. Residuals need to be out there, specifically layered residuals. And I like to spend a lot of time just educating people about that because it's important.
Matt, back in the old days when I first got into the business, we talked a lot, and I'm talking 30 plus years ago. We talked about the importance of early weed control and the impact of, what a seedling weed could cost that producer in terms of competition yield but also nitrogen lost and so on and so forth. We've kind of gotten away from that, haven't we, over the last 15, 20 years with glyphosate coming in, as you mentioned earlier, and just other different products. But we're really stepping back in time and have to re-educate folks, don't we?
We are. We just can't get behind, right? And talking on the economics of it, right? Weeds cost us money. They absolutely do, right? And there's various data sources out there that you can look at it, but a lot of the information that I look at when we're talking with today's, corn and soybean prices, it's pretty easy to get 30, 50, all the way up to $100 an acre of revenue loss just from weed pressure, right? And that's a scary place to be. And it's a place we should never be, because we can have a pretty effective weed control program for a lot less than what it's going to actually take off of the top number.
And Matt, based on a lot of the research that's done, I mean, gosh, even waiting for weeds to get up to that V3 stage, you really start to impact yields, don't you?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is that can also be influenced by row spacing, specifically in soybeans, right? If we're in narrow row soybeans, and I know due to some, white mold issues and other things, not everyone can use narrow row soybeans, but where we can use narrow row soybeans, and they will compete with the weeds a little bit better than a 30-inch row bean will, right?
Sure.
And it costs us the same to plant it, whether it's a 15 or a 30-inch planter, right? So those are some of the free weed control things that we can do by just planting narrow row soybeans.
There's just lots of different practices, like you mentioned, narrowing up your spaces a little bit to control some of that weed, to take advantage of some of that shading early on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it just eliminates a few days that weeds can germinate throughout the year, or even if they do germinate, they're going to be smaller, and less of them will survive. There's some interesting research out that shows the survivability of water hemp, specifically the later it germinates in the year, based on the growth stage of the crop. Not nearly as many survive. So that's pretty important for us.
Wow. Yeah, that's really important. So as we're taking, controlling weeds early is really important. And that's where I'm going to pull Brad Hammis in, because Helena's got a product called Grounded that can really help out any pre-emergent herbicide. Brad, tell us a little bit about Grounded and how it kind of performs and helps control weeds a little bit better than the average bear.
Sure. And it's all about having not just the right tool, like what Matt's talking about, but having the right place. Just because you have a tool in your workshop, your workbench that you can't reach when you need it, doesn't mean it's going to be an effective tool for you. And that's kind of what Grounded does. It's one of, if not the highest selling adjuvant in the entire lineup of the adjuvants that Helena works with. And what it does, based in a crop oil, it helps to hold the herbicides in the zone of soil, our residual herbicides, where those weeds are germinating. If you think about what we talk about when herbicides get activated, that just means that they wash far enough into the soil with rainfall to allow them to be where those seeds are actively germinating. And when we have a herbicide break, usually what happens is we got too much rain, and now we've moved that herbicide lower in that soil profile, and now it's no longer where it needs to be in order to kill those weeds. So with Grounded, we're able to keep that herbicide where it needs to be for a longer period of time. So that if you talk to the basic manufacturers, the chemical manufacturers, about how long of a residual period their herbicides should give you, you should get almost all of that when you utilize Grounded, as opposed to getting a big springtime rainfall and maybe all of a sudden you start seeing some of those water hemp pop up through the soil surface a week or two earlier than you would have otherwise expected them. And now if your plan was to go back out 3-4 weeks after your first residual application for your second pass, shoot, now you might be a week ahead of that schedule. And if you weren't expecting it, weren't looking for it, now you might have a whole week of growth on some of those weeds. And like what Matt said, if we're trying to control weeds at less than an inch tall and we get a week behind, that puts us in a pretty tough spot. We're going to have to rely on a lot more aggressive chemistries if we're going to have any control. And oftentimes those more aggressive chemistries have a little bit more of a detrimental impact on the crop yield as far as crop development goes.
Because if you wait that long, even your options might shrink based on, the growth of those weeds at a later stage. But Brad, what I'm hearing you say is by adding grounded into your pre, we can extend that time out typically, or at least keep that active ingredient in the kill zone a little bit longer.
Yes, that's exactly right, Bill. And I wouldn't even restrict it just to pre's, because that's one of those other things that Matt said, especially when there's a wonderful, and I say that with all sarcasm possible, band of geography across the Midwest where they're fortunate enough to have to manage white mold and sudden death. And those two diseases seem to have about opposite conditions for management, right? And we know with white mold, we want to go narrower, we want to stay in wider rows to really allow airflow down through that canopy. But when we do that, we'll leave ourselves open to a much longer germination window for some of those weeds that do have that later season germination characteristic, like a water hemp or any of the pigweed species would. So I'd like to see grounded additionally when we come back with our second pass residual, especially in soybeans, because that gives us that opportunity if we do have a season where maybe we got planted a little bit later or we're in a wider row configuration, and now we have protection through that potentially later canopy closure, like we sometimes do see.
So when we have, we started this conversation talking about, effective weed management on a budget. How does grounded fit into this conversation, Brad?
I'm not going to say it's the first dollar into the mix, but it's about as good of an insurance policy as you could possibly get on having a predictable spray season. And certainly the weather's always going to throw us that wrench, right? And it looks like from all the forecasts that they're showing for season long precipitation, at least across the Midwest, is we're supposed to be pretty nice. As you go further east, they look like they might be getting a little bit more rain this year, right? But
Sure.
even in a typical year, I'm not going to say average. I don't think average exists anymore. So maybe normal is the right word for that. But even in a normal year, we're always going to run into, it seems like, that stretch of time where we just get too wet and we can't get back out to the field. Right. And sometimes it's not that we didn't notice that our weeds were starting to come up. Sometimes it's that we're not physically able to get back across those acres because the field conditions aren't good. They're too wet to be driving anything across those fields. And that's another place where that insurance policy that grounded can kind of give you, as far as holding on to that residual herbicide, getting you that full control window like we would expect and like we plan for when we make those investments in our crop. That's really that value of grounded.
Brad, so really, it really does sound like grounded's that product you're making your investment in some pretty high end chemistry a lot of times for a pre or even a second pass, as you mentioned. But adding that grounded to the mix is going to ensure that it keeps that really important chemistry in that kill zone a little bit longer to give you the full efficacy of that particular product.
Yep, consistent and predictable. That's things that we like to have when we're trying to manage weeds.
And Brad, one of the neat things about grounded is this isn't really a new story. Grounded is proven. It's been around since 97, but it still has proven results.
Yeah, that's like I mentioned, I think even going into getting awfully close to what would be almost 30 years in our lineup here, getting awfully close to it almost.
Sure.
Being one of the top agents that we sell. And not just going out as that residual herbicide, but as it was originally developed and as the name would suggest, being a fantastic deposition aid. So anytime you're worried about the wind conditions in the spring and wanting to have a drift agent in that spray tank, you're also getting that along with grounded because of the properties that it has. Right. And one of the things that is really impressive is how many products a grower can fit into one tank mix sometimes. Right. And that can get pretty complicated. And as Matt was saying, is these herbicide programs, they're not getting more simple. We're typically getting more and more complex in that. And we do see some help with compatibility when we add grounded in mix. It just helps different active ingredients seem to get along better in that spray tank mix. So there's a lot of benefits to grounded in addition to just being a great product for holding on to our soil residual products.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. As we mentioned, grounded's been around a while, but we're kind of going back to the future, so to speak, with a lot of our chemistry programs. The good news is grounded's been a part of their journey as well. So it's proven itself back when some of the herbicides that we're starting to select for, crops like this year, they've been around and it's proven itself. So growers don't have a lot of risk at hand, do they?
That's a great point, Bill. Grounded has been around long enough that we know that if you have ground in the tank, it's easier to wash yellow herbicides off your pickup truck. If that gives you a time scale reference for how long grounded has been a key part of our adjuvant portfolio.
Matt, jump back to you a little bit. What are some other strategies growers should be considering in terms of effective weed management this year?
So one that I also get questions or comments on is cover crops, right? And we don't necessarily, often not the first thing brought up when it comes to weed control, but cover crops can, specifically cereal rye, can be used to supplement our weed control programs. But after doing a little bit of research for some other stuff I presented on the other day, I'm even more convinced that they work great, but they don't replace a herbicide program. In fact, we get better weed control when we apply a pre-emerge herbicide with those cereal rye cover crops. Whether we're planting green or terminating early, herbicides still increase our efficacy of control. And I think also, they can be a little controversial, right? Whether there's yield enhancements or yield loss, or it doesn't really affect yield. If I could pick, right, I would want to terminate a little bit early and not necessarily plant green into it, because I think that does eliminate some of the risk associated with potentially seeing a little bit of a yield lag with cereal rye specifically.
You bet. So, Matt, as growers are getting ready, are there any watch outs that you recommend? Watch out for this as you're getting into planting 25.
No, not necessarily on the pre side, right? I think people do the pre's and we're starting to do it. One thing I would say, don't cut your rates, right? Cutting rates is never going to extend our control. It seems obvious, but we can't do that, right? We absolutely make sure we need to be running the full rate so that we can get the best control out of these products, right? It costs us the same to spray 3 ounces of a product through a machine for an application cost, or if it's 6 ounces, we're spraying through that machine, right? So let's make sure we're taking advantage of those application costs.
That's a really good point, Matt. When we talk about application costs, it's the same fuel, the same dollars to cross that field. Why not give it? There's been millions and millions of dollars of research by manufacturers into these herbicides, and they've nailed it down to a rate that makes sense. Cutting that rate can do 2 things. A, give you bad performance, ultimately impacting your yield.
Mhm.
B, it can also give you some situation where you got to come back and hit it with a post that you maybe hadn't intended on. That's 2. But the third one, I call it kind of the hidden one, that is kind of the "oh, I gotcha" moment, is 2, 3, 4 years down the road where things become a little bit more resistant maybe to that herbicide that you're certainly counting on.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, right? That's not a place where we want to be. And, sometimes people will plan for a pre and then just a post application with just burn down foliar activity. But then they end up coming back for that third pass no matter what to try and clean up some escapes, right? And now we're getting kind of on the late side for some of these crops, specifically soybeans, where we can start having some dings into our yield. And we still probably don't have near the control that we would have if we would have just gone with a really good souped up 2-pass program.
So as growers get ready for plant 25, I'm kind of piecing this together, Matt, and Brad, you jump in here too, but it feels like starting off clean is your first step. And depending upon your situation where you farm, having multiple modes of action is really important. Would
Yep.
that be our first step?
Absolutely. And it's kind of a little bit of a joke, but they need to be effective sites of action, right? So just because you got 4 different sites of action, it looks cool having those numbers on the side of the jug. If they aren't effective on the weed species that you're targeting, you just wasted a bunch of money. So,
Man, you bring up a great point too there. Do we really need to be talking to our agronomist, our Helena rep, consultant, whoever it may be, to make sure we know what's out in that field based on last year's performance, don't we?
absolutely. Right? Because there's really no single site of action product that wouldn't benefit from some complementary chemistry, right? If you have a product that's really good on grasses, it may not be the strongest on some large seeded broadleaves or, amaranth, right? But then we can add in a product that might be weak on grass, but it's really good on those large seeded broadleaves. So we want to be stacking chemistry if we can in regards to active ingredients and make sure they're complementing each other. But like you said, that can vary from field to field or state to state, right?
Absolutely. And Brad, it feels to me like step number 2 is take a good look at grounded in at least your pre-emergent program and maybe your post, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Definitely. And to build off what Matt was saying on the agronomy side a little bit too, is sometimes you can find where you're looking at your effective sites of action. And if you have a particularly troublesome weed, you might be able to stack a couple different herbicide modes of action that really get to that same ultimate site of action in that plant. There's a compound cytochrome P450 in plants, and there's a lot of different herbicides that impact that one component of that photosynthetic process. So sometimes you can really lean in on that and build a couple different herbicides into your program that all hit that same thing from a different way. And that can make one side of action have a lot of different dings against it and have a little bit better weed control that way. I wanted to just throw this in there too, is we look at some of those watch outs for the season. One of those is, and I know I've heard a lot of conversation and not just this year, but anytime farm budgets get tight, commodities get a little bit lower, is growers like to look at the generic option sometimes. And one of the things that is often what makes them a little bit of a lower cost point is there's something taken out, right? It's not that full boat. It doesn't have the full formulation components to what the branded herbicide would be. It doesn't have the full in-can adjuvant package maybe that branded herbicide would have. And so if you do choose to go down that route, I think it's really, really important, not just grounded, but to look at all the different adjuvants that might complement your herbicide mix that you've come up with working with your agronomist to make sure that those active ingredients that you're paying for are actually getting to where you want them to get so they can be as effective as you need them to be to manage your weed, your fields, and keep clean fields throughout the entire crop season.
Yeah, definitely something to consider. There's going to be depending upon your budget, your situation, whether you go with a branded product, a generic product, you've got to make that decision with your agronomy team and your sales representative. But to your point, ensuring that you got a product like grounded in the tank is pretty critical to make all of those products perform at their highest capability.
That's exactly right, Bill. And the other type of adjuvant that I would put into that mix, that conversation, would be a water conditioner, right? Mm-hmm. Making sure that's one of those things when they develop herbicides, when they're working in the lab, they're always using pure water, right? So we know what those herbicides are supposed to do when they're in good water and they're not being deactivated, they're not being tied up or antagonized by any water hardness, by any pH, by any other factors that might be in your water, whether it's city water or well water, what have you. One of the things we can do by using a good water conditioner is we can get your spray water to be as close to that laboratory quality water as possible, right? If we understand what your water looks like, that gives us a lot of information on how we need to better manage it. One of the things that we've really been starting to learn here over this past maybe 6 months is the amount of time that some herbicides that happen to be fairly pH sensitive can be in that spray mix before they start to have a significant drop off in how they can perform because of being tied up. Sometimes is measured in minutes and never more than hours, right? If you finish a day and you're spraying and you didn't get everything sprayed out through that field and your sprayer sits overnight, depending on the tank mix that you have in that, you may have less than 50% of your active ingredients still active when you go out to spray again the next day, right? So that's one of those other pieces with using a good water conditioner. A lot of the sequestering agents and pH buffering products that we have in our lineup, they're really built for that longer period of time. Not that we want tank mixes to sit for a long time in a spray mix, in a sprayer, but if they are in there even for a day, right? That sometimes that can be enough if you get rained out for a while and you got to go back to the shed for a bit in the middle of the day, or you've got most of the tank and we don't want it to sit overnight, but sometimes that's what happens because of how the seasons go. Having that water conditioned more than just with an AMS, right? That's one of those weaknesses of an AMS being a salt in its most basic type of a chemistry form, is that it's not a long-term water conditioning, right? It'll help to clean up that water for a little while, but sometimes those reactions can reverse, and some of those hard water cations that we have, those impurities in our spray water, can come back to antagonize and tie up our herbicides again if they're left in that mix for a longer period of time.
So, Brad, what are some examples of some water conditioners that you recommend in your market?
There's a lot of great water conditioners from our Quest family. Quest and Request are some of our old staples. We have a lot of multifunctional water conditioning adjuvants like a Czar, like a Hellfire or a Smoke. Our newest one that we're really excited about going into this crop season, especially as we look at how important glufosinate really still is in a lot of the Midwest, is our new product Cohort. That was really built to support products where the label says AMS. Cohort's going to be a really natural, really effective, lower use rate adjuvant to go in there to give those herbicides that do need an ammonium component, like what we have a need for glufosinate across the Midwest. You're going to get everything you need out of that to have a pH buffer for those herbicides that like to have a little bit of a lower spray pH, which is most of the herbicides that we work with. You're going to get that pH management from a product like Cohort. From our testing, it's been highly effective, having a really strong win rate tested against that 3 pound, that standard use rate of AMS. No statistical difference at a lower use rate and a higher win rate. That seems like a pretty great solution to me, getting to pour some jugs instead of having to dump some bags and wait for them to get dissolved in our spray tanks.
Well, Cohort sounds like a product that's definitely going to save some backs, but still give the performance that is much needed for a lot of producers out there.
Yep. End of the day, that's what matters the most, right? Is using the product that's going to work the way it's supposed to.
You bet. And of course, that product's labeled with a variety of products in that area, in that family, correct?
Certainly. Yeah. Anytime you see on the label where it requires ammonium nitrogen or ammonium sulfate on that label, that's going to be a great fit for Cohort.
Great. Matt, we also talked about, kind of our third step, managing our posts, and we just touched on one, in this case, using Cohort as an adjuvant for some of our post options for some growers that are, kind of going down that path. What are some other tips that you can share from a post application standpoint?
Yeah, so we talked about the one, make sure we're spraying weeds early, right? Ding your schedule at 3 to 4 weeks after you go out with the pre. Let's get it on the calendar, so at least we're going to do it, because going out there 6 weeks after a pre probably isn't going to be real good for us.
Right.
The other thing, make sure we have, and I hate beating a dead horse, but make sure we have the best adjuvants for the herbicide that we're using in that post pass, right? If we can't control those weeds that are up, then the chances of us getting them after they grow for another week aren't very good, right? And then thirdly, layered residuals, right? This is when we can come back in with another, for example, a group 15 herbicide, apply that at the same time that we're typically doing that post pass, and hopefully keep our crops clean, specifically row crops, the month of June, right? That's a really big deal for us. So layering that residual is huge, right? That's allows us to finish a really good program. If we started our foundation with the pre-pass, we might as well finish it and do another layered residual, right?
You bet. Definitely stacking it up and lining it up, like you said, and really going into the season with a plan is really critical, isn't it, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. And sticking with that plan, right? The last few years we've been a little bit dry, and so when we're coming to those post applications, I get a lot of phone calls and concerns that, hey, I'm going to go out and spend $8 on this residual, and it's not going to get rained into the soil, and I'm not going to get any value out of it. So didn't have a great answer. So I've done some digging, and there's some work out there that's showing that we're still getting value out of that pre if it doesn't necessarily get rained in. Because typically we'd like to see rain 3/4 to an inch of rain. We get that within a few days, man, everything is perfect, right? Let's go buy a lotto ticket and we're good. However, there's some work done where they did 3 different group 15 herbicides, and I think they were looking at one of the foxtail species. I can't remember, but 100% control if you get 3/4 or an inch, maybe it was even a half an inch. However, they went down if you got 0 rain or even 1/10 of an inch of rain, they still ended up with 50% control of that.
Wow.
So it wasn't a complete waste of money. And I kind of equate this to some of us have had, for whatever reason, those disaster fields, right? You're out there in August and you look at that field and you're like, holy cow, this is bad, right? If that grower or farmer is standing there right next to you and you say, hey, give me $8 and I can go back in time and knock out half of those weeds, there isn't a grower or farmer that isn't going to give you that $8 and
Right.
tell you to get going. Right. So
Yeah.
we need to make sure we stick with that plan and include that residual in that post pass.
Matt, you bring up such a great point with that research. I mean, it is so tempting for producers to say, it's dry. I'm not going to go spend the money. It's not going to be worth it. But based on that data, even at 50% control in your foxtail example there, that is a lot of yield impact on any crop for Matt. That
Absolutely. And the other thing is we know competition from weeds is worse when our crops are stressed, right? Whether that's from nitrogen stress or drought would be the same thing. We're
Sure.
stressing that crop and we're not allowing it to compete. So in these drier years, weed control is absolutely crucial.
Wow. So having that plan, sticking with the plan, even if things don't, you're kind of questioning things a little bit, you're probably better off sticking with your plan in order to, maximize your yield and your returns at the end of the day.
Yep.
Well, Brad, as we kind of get ready to wrap up here, is there anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think that your last phrase really hit the nail on the head, Bill. Because at the end of the day, what's going to matter in a year like this is ultimately bushels. And I know it gets over talked and overplayed a little bit, but if we're sacrificing bushels because of decisions that we're trying to make or trying to avoid making with our weed management program, that's where this thing can get sideways as far as farm budgets go. I think in a hurry in a year like this, when especially if it ends up being, there were a lot of folks this past year that maybe didn't have the best, or it wasn't certainly an ideal crop year as far as weather-wise went, and we had record yields, right? And so
Right.
the ability of our crops to make it through some stressful conditions, I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot of scenarios where it won't still be good to make that investment. And I know I've heard Matt give this kind of a talk here over the past couple months, and he's broken it down into how many weeds per how many feet of row before you start seeing some yield loss, right? And it's amazingly small number of weeds or separation of weeds that you can still have that impact on what that yield looks like. And I'll let him talk about that here for a second. But
Sure, yeah.
At the end of the day, it's making the decisions now that we can make to do the best job of managing it that we believe we need to have throughout the season. Like you said, sticking to that plan. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about killing weeds because we don't like seeing weeds. We got to remember that when we see weeds out there, that means there's bushels we're not going to see this fall.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. When we see a weed out there, you have just impacted yield. And Matt, you've got some great research to support that.
So, Bill, I guess this would be the question. How much yield loss are we talking about when it comes to weed pressure? The University of Missouri has some data that I use a lot when talking about potential weed losses. Their data shows if you have 10 water hemp and 100 square feet, so imagine a 10 by 10 foot tarp on the ground in your field, that's 100 square feet. If there are 10 water hemp under that tarp, they found a 5 bushel an acre yield loss in soybeans and a 7 bushel an acre yield loss in corn. And that was assuming 50 bushel an acre soybeans and 150 bushel an acre corn. I imagine our yield losses today would be even greater.
Wow. So all the more reason we've got to have a good plan going in. We've got to stick with that plan and make sure that we're doing all those good fundamental things that we talked about on the front end of the show.
Absolutely. And one thing I would say is just, I'm by no means a weed scientist, right? Don't know everything about it, but boy, there's a lot of people that are smart. There's a lot of references, materials. Reach out for help, right? Because there is no way that we can just come up short. So it's too important for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Matt. We've gotten so comfortable with a lot of really good herbicides that have performed so well over the last 15, 20 years. Some of the data that you just shared with me is some of the same kind of content that we shared with producers 30, 40 years ago. And we're kind of back to that time again. And, understanding your weed species and your spectrum that's out there, going into that cropping year with a good solid plan with multiple modes of action is absolutely critical. And at the end of the day, that's going to be your cheapest method, is sticking with that plan to avoid any resprays, to avoid these kind of things that you just shared with us, Matt, avoiding that 1 or 2 water hemps per per 12 inches, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, guys, I want to thank you both for joining us on this episode of FieldLink as we get ready to plant this crop in 25 by better understanding weed management on a budget. And as we talked about, managing that budget may include some different tactics and trying to manage your weed spectrum as a whole. So, guys, I want to thank you for joining us here on this particular episode of FieldLink.
Thanks a lot, Bill.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
And welcome back to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith. Joining us from North Dakota today is Jody Lawrence. Jody, welcome back to FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill. It's good to be back. The world tour continues, and we are in balmy Bowman, North Dakota today, where tonight's low is going to be 40 degrees, which will set an all-time record for me being on the road. So today is an historic date, if for nothing else, for that.
Well, Jody, welcome to the Northland for sure. I'm sure there's lots to talk about. Jody, how are the attitudes up there as you're talking to producers in North Dakota this week?
Well, everybody's attitude's getting a little bit better because corn certainly has shown some signs of life that we weren't expecting at the end of 24. The yield cut by the USDA certainly played a big role into this that set the tone for, like we have talked about, potentially a higher ceiling, but certainly a higher floor. And as the negotiations and the tariffs have been pushed off till April now against Mexico, our largest corn buyer, we've had a solid rally. You know, you've got markets are closed today for President's Day, but you've got December corn trading around 475 futures. So it's as good as we've seen in quite a while. So and not that anybody's going to get rich doing it, but it becomes a much better base price to get started the season, you know, to talk about heading into March than we certainly anticipated. Beans still under the influence a little bit, not many beans growing up here, but beans under the influence of South America's massive crop. That's pretty much it. I think everybody is, attitudes are improving and shifting from prepay and planning to moving on to let's get rolling with get all the machinery ready and in 2 months let's be in the ground.
Right. Well, and there's definitely a lot of energy happening now that corn prices are kicking up in that part of the country. Of course, being out there in North Dakota, you're also in the edge of cattle country there. There's a lot of cattle out there. Cattle doing pretty well out there across the entire commodity market.
Yeah, they're doing particularly well, and there are several things, really a lot of long-term factors that play into this, that what we're seeing, which is so interesting, is really you go back to 2018, the financial collapse of 2018, or one of them, and what we have always expected about cattle is the demand for beef, especially in the U.S., would be very tightly tied in with the stock market. And during those times when margins were tough and prices, were a good bit lower, when you had cattle in the 120 to 140 range instead of the pushing 200 right now on the lives, the cattle industry was really, really good at managing inventory and the growth of it. And they have kept the on-feed numbers at a point where when we got to COVID, although the initial drop, simply the great unknown of nobody knowing what was going to happen there, that once the dust settled a little bit, the U.S. consumer realized that they had money. They, a huge majority were still had jobs, and certainly there was some stimulus money, and they began eating better cuts of steak at home than they would buy at the restaurant for a lower price. And that has continued to feed into the market, where the American consumer, especially now with it seems like, over the since the election, you've got new highs in one of the indexes just about every day. The equity indexes that the markets have really done a good job of keeping consumer demand up as the rest of the economy and the equity markets, people feel more confident that they can go out and spend that money because we're seeing the demand. All the cattle on feed numbers are certainly not expanding. We're going to be, if we're not making record prices in feeders and live cattle the next quarter, I'd be really surprised. But that's always a barrier to entry because you look at what you have to spend on a feeder now, or just the combination of raising cow-calf operation. It's going to be interesting, but for right now, really don't see any end to it unless for some reason this administration just decided to open up all the borders to as much cattle as we could import, and we don't see that coming.
No, we don't see that coming at all. And we're at an era right now, cows, just the total cattle population for cows, bred cows, we're at the lowest point we've been in 75 years. And, with these high feeder prices, stocker growers we're not retaining those heifers. So therefore, those numbers are going to be pretty low here, potentially for the next couple of years. So that cattle market could be strong, at least for the next 2 years.
Yeah, because the turnaround time, unlike the grain industry or the soy, the grain or soys, is so much slower, and even than it is on the pork and the poultry. Of course, bird flu, I'll take that out of that part of the poultry equation. But yeah, the cattle industry is in great shape and doing well, but there are nervous times when you're getting in at all-time new highs to keep replenishing your herd, for sure.
That's right. Growers are going to really manage that herd for sure, especially with these high feeder prices. Okay, Jody, let's move to politics a little bit. We're into about 4 weeks into a new administration. There's certainly been a lot of news headlines, not every day, but about every 2 minutes. Talk to some of my colleagues that are in the media, and they're having a sprint workout. They haven't worked this hard in a long time trying to keep up with the news out of D.C. But how are things moving with right now, from your perspective, with the Trump administration and the Chinese?
We'll go with Mexico and Canada. Those tariffs have been postponed till at least April 1st. They gave them a 30-day reprieve when the negotiations started right after inauguration. So Canada for other reasons, but Mexico the biggest reason because they're our largest corn buyer, and we need to keep on a very good place with them. And that's some of the optimism that we see in corn, and their sales or their purchases continue to be strong. But then you take the other side of it when you talk about China, the initial optimism of, I think, within the first 3 or 4 days after inauguration, Trump and Chairman Xi talked twice, and since then have not talked at all. And whether they are turning it over to their trade negotiation teams in backroom kind of situations, a lot like happened from 2018 to 20, nobody really knows. But it seems to me that for the time being, they are maybe not necessarily at a stalemate, but they are not in any position where China's going to be running to re-implement their participation in phase one and finish that out for those 80 to 85 billion dollars worth of imports, because there are a lot of things with their economy still stuck in the mud that they simply don't need, and we can't force somebody to buy things they don't need.
Right.
And the funny point that you made, talking to your friends in the media, I read a tweet or something that the previous administration, they made it a habit of their press releases were from 8 a.m. on Monday to 3 o'clock on Friday. And Trump is a 24-hour news cycle in himself. So everybody's work has changed, and you can insert your obvious jokes anywhere in there that you want to. But I do find it interesting because I think all of us are paying more attention to anything. We could wake up on a Sunday, especially in a long weekend like this, even though the markets tonight are not called, much changed, that any number of things could happen, and we could have all sorts of volatility to get started. But I like it because we have action inside of our markets, and it's not just a dead stalemate of bad news or no news, that we are heading in the right direction, I would say. And I've got I've got some growing optimism about where the grain markets are going, and being in wheat country. Certainly wheat can be pulled into that with corn, but beans, with the size of the South American crop, and that Brazil is about 25% to a third finished of harvesting their own 6 billion bushel crop, makes it hard to think that beans are going to come rallying up and be as well supported as the grains anytime during harvest, at least.
Yep. A lot happening for sure. And, things taking place in D.C. are certainly impacting not just the commodity markets, but really all of the markets across the board. And Jody, want to thank you for joining us from that chilly North Dakota country that you're up and today. Hope you stay warm and look forward to having you join us next time.
All right. Thank you, Bill. And we will see everybody at Commodity Classic. I believe it's going to start 2 weeks from yesterday. So look forward to seeing everybody out there in Denver.
Absolutely. We'll see everybody in Denver. Jody will be joining me at the studio, on the stage, in the booth, and we're going to be talking about commodities. We're going to talk about different markets, trade, you name it. We're going to be there, and happy to take some of your questions. So be sure to join us in Denver at the Commodity Classic coming up here March 1st through the 3rd in Denver. Jody, take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Accessing product information, news and location data, payment portal information, and much more just got easier. Be sure to check out our new Helena Agra website at helenaagra.com.